enough is enough. Go home and stay home. If people do not follow these guidelines, we will put much more stringent measures in place. If you do not comply with these instructions, you could face serious fines and even prison time.
So a clear a change, a shift in tone from the Prime Minister this week as the number of cases in this country continues to rise and the restrictions tighten. So is the government's message reaching Canadians? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue. They are doing their part and staying home. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is in Ottawa. Good to see you all. Appreciate you doing this via remotely. Let's start with some of those strong words we heard from the Prime Minister this week, a real escalation in tone from the Prime Minister. Chantal Hébert, what did you make of it? Did it come at the right time?
Yes, because part of the issue is getting public opinion ramped up to accept those messages. So at this point, I think a lot of Canadians were ready for that tone. Two, I don't know about Toronto and Ottawa, but in Montreal, it looks to me like a lot of people are actually doing what they're supposed to do. The city is virtually empty. But three, there have been nice things and a lot of, I think, well-deserved credit given to premiers like François Legault, who has been talking fairly sternly about things like that for a while. Mm-hmm. So I think the Mr. Nice Guy thing in Ottawa was not necessarily the best approach at this point.
And it came, Andrew, sort of about a day before the government decided that the Quarantine Act would be used and people coming back into this country would now face this mandatory isolation. Did those things all have to sort of happen, as Chantal points out, to get to that place?
I'm not sure. I think the government bears some of the responsibility for whatever backsliding or lackadaisical attitude some Canadians may be taking to this. This is the government that for a long time was saying the risk was low, that they didn't need to enforce controls at the borders, for example, that when they didn't send people out to, didn't have proper advisories when people for incoming flights. Mm-hmm. So they've now decided to get serious about it. They've now decided to slam on the brakes. They now want to look very tough on this. That's all well and good. But I think, as I say, they may be overreacting slightly now because they were underreacting before.
Althea, what do you think?
I think it's too early to say if they're actually overreacting because we haven't seen anything with regards to enforcement. And on the enforcement for a lot of the measures that they have announced in the past, it just wasn't there. You know, when they said there were going to be stricter border controls, when you went through the airport, actually, like, nobody asked you anything. And it was like, then a few days later, it was like just a form on the terminal where you like accept that you have read it and that, you know that the government wants you to self-isolate. I agree with Chantal that it took some time to get public to buy into the idea of a forced quarantine. That being said, it seems like the government's messaging doesn't necessarily match what its policy prescriptions are. You know, we had Chrystia Freeland this week come out and say, and actually the Prime Minister this morning as well, said this is going to make Canadians feel a lot safer. Well, if you think this was going to make Canadians feel a lot safer, why didn't you do this a week ago or 2 weeks ago? Now we're hearing from public health officials that most people are getting COVID-19 through community transfers, not through travel. So if you wanted to, safeguard us from the travelers, you should have acted sooner.
Well, speaking of the messaging, and some of it has been, I would say it's particularly around the Quarantine Act, a little bit confusing and unclear, but there have also been what some people are characterizing as missteps, and I'm talking there about, of course, the legislation where the government, according to the Conservatives anyway, overreached. Was that, were they able to salvage things enough that won't be something that will be remembered as a mistake, Chantal?
I suspect that with people losing their jobs in huge numbers every day, with kids not going to school, what happened on Parliament Hill this week is not going to stick for very long. I'm not saying that that's a great thing, and I do believe in the end that Parliament worked this week. But you need to hive off what happens in Parliament with what happens on the street in real life. And I believe at the end of the day, every politician in this country is going to be judged on where we end up and where we go from there, and not what happened in Parliament this week.
That's fair, but it did become a moment, Andrew, where sort of the collaboration was on pause and the politics was very apparent.
it was a disgraceful overreach. Everybody understands that we're in extraordinary times and extraordinary measures are needed. I think the opposition parties themselves had signed on to that. People were prepared to give the government a great deal of leeway, but to assert an unlimited power to tax, spend, and borrow for up to 2 years. And in addition, there were clauses in there that allowed the Minister of Employment to basically rewrite the Employment Insurance Act on the fly. These kinds of things are so far beyond any notion of parliamentary government. They're completely unnecessary. One has the feeling that the government saw an opportunity to basically insulate itself in a minority parliament from effective scrutiny for 2 years. And took it. And if the opposition hadn't stood up to it, I think that would have been bad, not only for Parliament, but bad for fighting this virus. We have to keep all the public on board, not just the people who support the government, but the people who are very skeptical of this government. And if we don't have an effective Parliament scrutinizing them and giving voice to people's concerns about the way the government's handling this, then we're not going to be able to have that kind of democratic buy-in that we need.
Althea, and I can see Chantal wants to say one more thing. Althea?
It was a colossal mistake. I don't actually believe that the Liberals were trying to safeguard the minority government for 2 years. I think not enough people saw this piece of legislation. And some people thought they were being a little clever and thought like, oh, we can use, we don't know when this is going to end. Let's give ourselves as much padding as possible. I think it was gross incompetence, frankly, and embarrassing. And it will go down in the history books as yet another example of the Liberal government trying to deny the official opposition its role. I mean, we saw that with Motion 6 a few years ago. So this isn't the first time that the Liberals have tried to shortchange Parliament. But they were on such a good positive course. You know, they were sending a government plane to pick up the leader of the official opposition and bring in everybody basically in Ottawa to sing Kumbaya. And we had, Chantal's right, we saw Parliament actually work well. The opposition leaked the content of the legislation. There was public outrage. The government scaled back. The NDP was able to say that they also influenced the government by having this $2,000 a month flat payment as opposed to going through the EI system, which is a modified version of what the NDP had been proposing. And then we saw the influence that one single member of Parliament can have, and that's Conservative MP Scott Reid, who heard about this overreach, the government giving itself powers until 2021. Deciding this was outrageous, was not going to give unanimous consent, drove to Ottawa. I mean, his writing's not too far from Parliament Hill. And then basically he convinced his own party to backtrack against a unanimous consent that they had given the Liberals 2 weeks ago. And so there is going to be more Parliament scrutiny on how the Liberals spend money because of that one MP, Scott Reid.
Okay, last point to you, Chantal.
Okay, one, the saving grace for the government is that it happened over a one-day news cycle, which no one could afford, including the government, a parliamentary crisis that stretched beyond that one day. But I'm guessing the more disquieting thing is if you don't believe that someone sat in a room and thought, oh, we're going to get control of Parliament for 2 years, which I happen not to believe, it's more disquieting to worry that it's incompetence and / panic at work, and that is worrisome.
All right, the other thing that the government is having to contend with in the midst of this pandemic is, of course, its relationship with the United States, having to negotiate this limited movement at the U.S.-Canada border, and then reports this week that the government confirmed that there was some sort of conversation around putting increased troops far back from the border, but still there in order to monitor the situation. The Deputy Prime Minister was asked about it. Here's what Chrystia Freeland said.
Canada is strongly opposed to this U.S. proposal, and we have made that opposition very, very clear to our American counterparts.
So the president was asked about this on Thursday as well. He didn't seem to be very much in the know, but it is something that has been discussed clearly, that officials are discussing and that Canada is pushing back on. How much of an issue, I'll start with you, Andrew, is this, the prospect of a thickening border in the midst of all this at a time when the United States now has, at the time we're recording this anyway, the most number of cases of COVID-19 in the world?
The most number of cases and the fastest growing outbreak in the developed world. So, if there's anybody who's concerned about people crossing the border, it should be Canada at this point. But this upsets understandings that go back decades, almost since the founding of the country between the two countries. So much of our relations depends upon mutual trust, mutual cooperation. The United States is as heavily invested in that as we are, or maybe not as heavily, but they profit from that as we do.
Sure.
So I hope the message, if there are saner heads around the president, I hope the message got through to them that this would not be viewed favorably and would, lead to a lot of lack of cooperation on this side.
It seems to be, in some ways, a largely symbolic measure too, Althea, because as Andrew says, it's unclear, what exactly the U.S. is trying to prevent, given that they are more in a crisis situation than we are for now, anyway.
So what some sources in the government have told me is basically they believe that this emerged out of a discussion about the U.S. handling their southern border.
Right.
And so there's a discussion about sending more soldiers over there, and some people suggested, well, maybe we should send some soldiers up north too. It doesn't seem, and Chrystia Freeland said this, and those around the Prime Minister have said that there have not been discussions at the very, very senior level. So not with President Trump, not with Vice President Pence, not with Secretary Pompeo. And so perhaps by the Prime Minister being asked about this and coming out very strongly, and Freeland saying she thinks this would be damaging to the relationship, maybe there will be a climb down. I mean, people suggest all sorts of stuff, I think, and a lot of people are using this crisis to do things that they have always wanted to do.
Sure.
And maybe this is just, things are moving so rapidly that it's not, I think, unexpected that there may be crazy ideas floated. It's just whether they get enacted. I think that's a bigger question.
Yeah, Chantal.
For a government, and I'm talking about the U.S., to want that is media sensitive and that wants coverage of its own soldiers stopping its own citizens from leaving the country. That doesn't sound like a very savvy move, because the notion that hordes of Canadians would suddenly want to leave a place with public health care to go in a country that has an out-of-control pandemic and no public health care, it kind of boggles the mind. And it is worrisome, I guess, because it speaks to what has been happening just south of us, and we live in the same geographical environment.
How much of an issue is that going to be over the next couple of weeks, Andrew, do you think, without us pretending to be public health experts? The travel now seems to have been largely locked down, but we also know that many, many people have returned over the past, week or so, including snowbirds who are in the United States.
Well, and it's going to be even more of an issue as time goes on, because the outbreak in the United States is so advanced. We've got our own troubles here, but the numbers are mounting so rapidly in the United States that I think it's going to be an increasing question as to how open we can keep this border as time goes on. When it really starts to peak in the United States, when the probabilities rise so much higher, from that somebody might be carrying it, it's going to be a real question for the government.
And is it something that we can do without fear that we can't undo it down the road, Chantal?
I'm not convinced that we can't undo it down the road. We just renegotiated NAFTA. Yeah. Clearly, the interest of the U.S. Is for a border to be pretty fluid. And that will be even more the case for both countries once we get through this tunnel. Because if you're going to kickstart the economy, you can't have a thick border between the two.
But I'll end up with this, Althea. When you hear the president...
In an election year, I should have added.
Yes, of course. But you also have a president right now who's talking about backing off on some of the social distancing measures and public health measures. So all of those things, you don't want to start easing things on one side and not on the other, Althea.
No, who knows what's really going to happen with that Easter timeline that the president has floated this week for having everybody packing the churches. Like, that didn't scare all of us. It's possible that the government, and they said this very clearly on Thursday, may have to enact other changes. For example, with the truckers that are coming in from the United States, does that mean that they need to let go of what they're carrying and a Canadian trucker takes it over at the border, or will they be isolated in a certain zone? Who knows? I think the government itself doesn't really know what it would contemplate, only that it can't really rule out anything at this point, as probably it shouldn't.
Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you all. I appreciate it very much.